Welcome back to the channel folks, and to another painting guide, and the subject is another classic set. That's the Flak Nest, one that I've really looked forward to painting. I've had this in my stash for a very long time, ended up selling it to a client who missed out on an auction on eBay because I knew I wouldn't get around to painting it myself, but I really want to give this a go, so I thought I'm definitely going to share this with you folks. I would have liked to make my own version of this at the same time as painting these in the same way as I did with the objective markers that I shared recently, but time's against me. But it's not too difficult folks if you want to do this yourself. Plastic cards, cocktail sticks, maybe bamboo skewers, and a few odds and ends you might have in your bits box, and you could definitely make one of these for yourselves. And just for information folks, they are on large base size. And here's the back of the box folks. You can see there's a lot of detail on these, but nothing that is beyond the skills of a Flames of War scratch builder. But let's get cracking on with the painting folks. So first of all, you can see I have partly painted the guns already. I put the camo on at the same time as I was painting a couple of half tracks to save a bit of time there. Now you can just keep these plain dark yellow, they don't need a camo pattern. I'm not going to show you how to do that because I've got so many videos on the channel where I paint German camo, so you can check them out in the playlist folks. Using the airbrush I've applied a shade coat of olive brown, but it's quite tricky to get into all the little nooks and crannies for a sculpt like this using the airbrush, so I'm still going to use the brush to do a quick tidy up. Focusing mainly on the deeper areas, it doesn't take too long, and the fact that you've got that airbrush coat down first makes it go really quick. And you can see there's lots of character, lovely details on here, so they're going to be fun to paint folks, and I'll go through all the important stages with you. I'm going to start on the inside, and I'm going to build up layers of streaky paint, and the combination of layers and streakiness will give a nice uneven look. I'm starting with Splinter Camo Base from Panzer Aces. It's a greyish colour, but it's not too grey. It's nearer the white and the sort of plaster side of things that we're after. Now I'm not wanting a solid coat here. I will give it 2 passes, but each time I'm keeping the paint quite wet and semi-opaque. And the next step is going to be with Deck Tan, which is quite close to white, but it's still a greyish kind of colour. As with the first colour, I'll be keeping this streaky, not putting the paint on too thick at all, which is not something that you want to be doing when you're painting large areas anyway, but the idea is that subtle streakiness will start to build up. You can focus on the streakiness to a degree, but just let it happen itself. This is a very simple approach that will give us a very effective result for the look we want to achieve here. Now we're on to the floorboards. Now you can see me drawing the brush across the flat surface of the board there and trying to avoid the deeper areas, but it's not too important if we hit them because we're going to do a shade later. Now it's important to note though that I'm not doing a dry brush. I don't want a dry, dusty looking layer of paint here. I'm putting the paint on sufficiently wet so it gives us a semi-opaque layer that we can build up through a second pass, just as we did with the walls, leaving a little bit of the shade colour to show through. I'm going to shade the floor using my go-to acrylic pin wash from MIG Ammo. Now you can see me applying it to the floorboards themselves. It's very well defined, so it's easy to do. I'm going to try and avoid darkening it down too much by applying it across the whole surface. There are times where that's preferable, but I don't want to do that here. This wash is a dark brown colour, and I've also used it to create just a couple of spots on the walls and a few streaks on the walls. As you'll see, as part of the weathering, I'm applying some washes there around the windows, doors and such likes. Let's go back to our base colour of old wood and just pick out those floorboards just a little bit. We're not looking for a solid coat of paint on each floorboard here. We still want to try and keep that very kind of look with the shade colour just sort of bleeding through at various points. And to add a bit more colour in there, a bit more variety and a little bit of a highlight, I'm going to use some medium grey. One of these little cottages has an earthen floor, but I don't want to just paint it with an earthen colour because that would be quite dark. So I'm going to use dark sand, which as you can see is quite bright. It's going to take a couple of coats to build this up, but just as with the wooden and the plastered areas, I don't want solid coats of paint here, folks. Using the same brown wash that I applied to the floorboards, I'm going to apply this in a much broader sweeping kind of sense all over the surface, but I'm going to keep it really thin. I'm going to let it dry, and where necessary go back in and apply a bit more. I want to pay attention to the corners to get them darker looking because there'll be less light in there, more light in the middle of the room. Back to the walls again, and I'm going to add a bit more character to them. I'm going to get them looking a bit dirty, and I'm going to focus in the main around the window frames, door frame and in the corners. I'm using the ochre wash from the same range of Mig Ammo washes that I used for the floors. And then you can see I'm starting to feather it out to get a bit softer around the edges, and then also just to start dotting it around, you know, breaking up the larger surface areas between the windows and the doors and such. There's still quite a bit of work to do on the interior, but I want to do some work on the outside just now. Painting the logs can seem a bit daunting because there's quite a lot of them, but the process I'm using is really quite simple and fast. It gives a bit of a detailed look to it when it's finished, but I'm not spending a great deal of time creating that detail. I'm simply drawing the brush along the line of the logs, starting in a systematic way, sort of painting it on the flat surface of the logs, then making sure I go back to hit the top curve and then go back to hit the bottom curve, so I'm moving it around in my hands all the time so that I am minimising the amount of shade that is left between those logs. It's important that we don't leave that shade too stark here, especially because it's so repetitive. It's line after line after line after line. Then I'm going to use the US Field Drab to apply a glaze over the entire surface. Now remember folks, a glaze isn't a wash in the sense that it's going to lie in the recessed areas. It's going to be a coat of paint that goes over the entire surface in an even way. That way it will soften the shade and help bring the shade and the main colour together, but still leave those dark recesses that I'm after. Next up is a highlight, and I'm going to use old wood here, and I'm only going to apply it on the top and flat areas of the logs. I'm not going to turn it around to hit the bottom areas, so there'll be a smooth transition into the darker areas on the underside. A few highlights on the ends, the cut ends of the wood will be good here folks, just to help pick out that detail, and that's us done for the logs. One of these cottages has a plaster or rendered surface instead of the log, so there is a bit of exposed log, which is a nice bit of detail in the corner there. So I'm going to paint this in the same way as I painted the interior walls, except instead of starting with Splinter Camel Base, I'm going to start with German Camel Beige. Now the outside surface is quite rough, so when I'm putting on the next layer, which is going to be deck tan, I'm going to try and capture that detail by not applying the paint too heavily. You've got to keep a good control on the amount of paint on your brush and how wet it is. So it's another 2 streaky layers here. And just to brighten things up a little bit, so it definitely looks different from the inside, is a few streaks of off-white. This cottage also has some stones around the space, so I'm going to tidy them up because they'll have been hit by the brush with the loose action that we've had on the outside render there. And then I'm just going to use some greys. I'm going to use dark grey, Luftwaffe uniform grey, a few bits of London grey, just to pick the stones out against the olive brown shade. Okay, let's move on to door frames, window frames and shutters. And I'm going to be quite bright with my colours here, make them stand out quite strongly but still weather them down quite nicely. This cottage has shutters and window frames, so it's a good opportunity to use different colours, not just stick with the one. So I'm starting on the window frame with old wood. I'm layering it on in the standard way that I do, taking care to leave just the right amount of shade colour between all the different shapes and components of the carving, so it stands out quite strongly. But remember folks, it's going to take you 2 coats, and don't leave too much shade. That second coat you're going to define that shade right down to the minimum you need to get the shape. And I'll be giving these areas, these edges, all the little details, a highlight of Iraqi sand. And I'm also going to take the same approach to the window frames and door frames that are inside the houses themselves. So these are going to be plain and unpainted effectively. Now on to the shutters, and it's going to be quite a bold red here. I started with a shade colour, burnt cadmium red. Any kind of dark red will probably do folks. And then you can see I'm starting to pick out the shape of all the panelling and bracing that goes together to make up the shutters and the doors. So I'm layering it, leaving the red shade to help define the shape. I'm not applying this layer as a solid coat because I'm after a weathered look, and I'll tackle the final weathering in the next stage. I'm also going to be using a light blue and a more subdued, darker kind of green. As a highlight for the doors, the frames and the shutters, I'm going to use old wood and apply it in a way to suggest that the paint has been chipped off, worn off, scratched off to expose the wood underneath. So it's going to get a highlighted appearance to help it stand out, to give it more definition, but also a nice worn and weathered look. And you can spend a bit more time, for instance, on the areas of the door that might receive more wear. Here I am putting a heavier amount of exposed wood, basically, the scratching and the chipping on the bottom of the door. Here you can see the blue, and it's bleaching down quite nicely with the exposed wood coming through. And the green. I'm going to use Iraqi wood to highlight the plain unpainted boards. Against the washed surface, this will stand out quite strongly, so don't use too much, but it will help us get a nice definition of the shape of all the individual boards in there. Now there's lots of sandbags on these minis folks, and you find them in the windows inside and out. And how I'm painting them is by layering on medium grey. When I say layering on, of course, I mean I'm going to be leaving shade between all the sandbags. It's going to take 2 coats at least because it's quite a light colour on a dark background. That second coat you're going to really define how much shade that you are showing so that it doesn't get too dominant. And if necessary you can do a little glaze over the top, just as we did with the logs of the medium grey, to soften things down a bit. And as a highlight I'm going to just pick out the details of those individual sandbags with some deck tan. And I'm going to be using these same colours on the interior folks, because let's not forget that's just as well detailed as the outside. Now to the boarded up windows. Here I'm applying a wash of German Camel Black Brown over an initial coat of old wood with a couple of panels of different colours, just to add a bit of variety, and imagine that they have used wood from all sort of different sources just to block up these windows. So there's some reds and some white, but not too much there. And for those coloured boards, well, I'm just going to roughly scrape the brush across the surface, so to speak, almost like scratching it across the surface. It's a wet brush, it's not a dry brush, but just to get a broken, uneven finish to them. And now we're on to the top, where all the action is, all the activity is, with lots and lots of little bits of detail. Now a couple of points here. There are sandbags, and you know how to paint them from how you've seen the windows. There are floorboards, and you saw how to paint them from inside the house, and there are logs. So I'm not going to go over that. What I would say is though, you have the opportunity, if you wish, of choosing to use the same colours for the wooden elements as you have for the rest of the house, or go for something a little bit different. I've used the same colours because I'm imagining that they've cannibalised nearby cottages to complete the nests, but you could say they've cut fresh wood, plain fresh boards and paint it up to make it look a little bit different. The choice is creative and the choice is yours. Now I'll show you how I painted some of the detail. I'm not going to show you absolutely everything because there's quite a lot, and some of it's fairly standard stuff like rifles and the SMG and so on. So just show you some key areas for you to get some ideas for. Starting with this tarpaulin, I want it to be a darker and contrasting colour against the sort of plain wooden background. So I'm not going to use tan kind of colours here. I'm going to go for my typical German grey colour, which is starting with the shade of olive brown, layering up dark mud and then highlighting with green grey. As is the case with this layering approach, don't let the highlight colour get too dominant. Remember, it's just there as an accent to help contrast with the shade and define the shape. It's not the main colour. The main colour is going to be the dark mud. There's quite a lot of camo netting on the rooftops, so I've started by ensuring that they've got a nice tidy shade coat of olive brown, and then using my sort of wet dry brush approach you've seen me doing, I'm going to give it a good solid coat of American green, a sort of olive dark green kind of colour. And for a highlight, once again, lightly brushing on in the same way as the main colour, I'm going to use some green grey. As with many camo nets, there will be little strips of tape or fabric attached to the surface, so I've first of all gone over them with a little bit of German camo black brown. That's just to ensure they're going to stand out clearly when I apply a coat, in this case of lighter green. It's a kind of washed out colour, an Africa core colour from the Panzer Aces range, but any kind of light green or even a tan colour here will stand out nicely and give these fairly large pieces a little bit of detail. There's quite a lot of boxes on the top here. A lot of them are underneath bits of detail, so it's good to paint them before you paint the other detail. If you can, paint from the bottom up, so that you're not having to get in and around already completed work. It's a good idea. And I'm going to paint these with my standard layering approach. I've got the shade colour down there already, so I'm just going to paint on the individual planks of the box, individual panels with some old wood, and then it'll be a careful highlight with some Iraqi sand. And I'm also using the old wood as a base colour for the discarded ammunition cases. And the radio set that's going to be on the command bunker. Here's the highlight going down on the boxes, and you can see how that bright colour really helps define the shape. It's quite a stark contrast to the shade, so just make sure you're getting things in balance. It's not too much shade, not too much highlight, but it helps them stand out against a similar coloured background of the roof there. For the radio and ammo cases, the main colour is going to be Middlestone, so I'm going to be leaving the old wood as the shade colour and Middlestone as the main colour, layering it up. You could just paint the ammo cases with German grey and perhaps dark grey, just for a fairly plain metallic finish as well. That might be more appropriate even for these pieces, but I'm choosing the Middlestone colour here just to keep things nice and bright. There is opportunity to paint some camo on the, what did you call them, shelter halves, shelter quarters, I can't quite remember, folks, you can tell me in the comments. So I'm going to paint my standard splinter camo. My base colour is German camo beige World War II, and then I paint sort of jaggy blotches, little jaggy shapes, and you can add to them if you don't feel you've put too much on, so feel your way through the process, folks. My first colour is the brown camo blotches from the Panzer Aces range, and then just the standard model colour range, it is German camo bright green. Then for a bit of shading, for a bit of shape and definition, I'm going to take some German camo black brown and a fine brush and paint in seams and the deeper folds. Now, as you can see, there's lots of other little bit of detail that I could go through painting with you, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to now move on to showing you the final task, which was attaching the crew. Now, you can just put the crew on their bases directly into the recessed circles that you can see, and then paint the surface to match the surrounding area. But I'm going for something that hopefully is going to look a bit better First of all, I'm taking the crew and cutting off the bases, just leaving little tabs underneath each foot. Then I'm going to fill each of the recessed circles with green stuff, carve in the shape of the board to match the surrounding area, and then I'm going to press the figure into the green stuff. And this is a very simple process. You just got to really be careful, push it down. Any gaps that appear, any little excess areas of green stuff that have been pushed up, we'll just tidy that up. It's a very, very quick process actually, folks. And there you go. I've not covered the detail of painting the crew. I've got so many other videos out for that. This was more a focus on the unique components of these wonderful flak nests that I'm glad I've had the opportunity to paint. As usual, there's going to be a little slideshow of completed pictures coming at the end if you want to stay tuned for that, folks. Otherwise, just leaves me to say thanks for watching as always, thanks to the subscribers out there, and to you folks that just drop into the channel from time to time to see what we're doing. If you'd like to support the channel and help us grow and bring more of this kind of painting content and Flames of War content to YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell button, and we'll definitely see you all on the next one.